The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I commenced my remarks last week, and early in my response, I said something to the effect, I don't have the page in front of me, but that this chamber can be both inspiring and exasperating, and that it's at its best when we are debating the big ideas of the day and the large questions that face Islanders, and we're doing that with open minds and good hearts. And it is at its worst when it descends into small-minded pettiness, I think was the phrase that I used, and partisanship. And it's been sad for me in the last 24 hours to see an example of exactly that small-minded pettiness and partisanship, which is really, it does this House no credit, and it is of no benefit to Islanders when we are particularly at a time when we're faced with some real challenges here in our community. Mr. Speaker, it's been a couple of very eventful days since I began speaking in my response to the throne speech, and over the weekend we've seen just how fast things can change when it comes to COVID. The events of the past few days have shown just how delicate the relative safety that we have worked so hard to build here over the last 12 months actually is. I spoke during my opening remarks today about the debt of gratitude, as did the Premier and members of the third party, about the debt of gratitude that I and my caucus and indeed all members of this House have towards the essential workers on Prince Edward Island who continue to do that most necessary work to keep us safe and to provide us with the basics that all Islanders need to continue life, as if, it's difficult to say the word normal, of course, but as if we were living in normal days. And further, I want to reiterate my sincere thanks to all Islanders, especially young Islanders, and again, through some of our questions today and statements that we've made already on this day in the House, we have singled out that part of our community here who have stepped up magnificently when they were called to do and to keep us as a larger community safe. Thank you to them. Despite these immediate pressing COVID-related issues, we also need to recognize that the way that issues like housing and climate change and poverty and building an equitable society cannot be ignored, even in a pandemic, perhaps especially in a pandemic. When I last spoke in my response to the speech from the throne, a debate was adjourned and I was discussing the need to see immediate and decisive action on climate change. And I think I said at the time that this throne speech, we were looking for decisive action, and this throne speech was not it. One of the key policies that will help us get to carbon neutrality and improve the quality and livability of island homes is the adoption of a net zero building code. One of my caucus members, of course, a former architect, is an expert in this area and has been promoting since his time in his seat in this House that we adopt net zero building codes across this province. And in large part, thanks to his advocacy and hard work, we see that government is moving in that direction, and I'm very glad to see that. We have a school slated to be built to net zero standards, and it is our hope, and I know it's the hope of the member who is the expert in this field, that all public buildings that are built from now on in this island will be built to a net zero standard, and I thank him for his work on that. Now, we'll also need a plan to change out all of the, for example, all of the oil furnaces that still exist in many Islanders' homes. And I think the Premier mentioned absolutely correctly the statistic on that is that it's disproportionately low-income Islanders who have that heat source in their homes. And of course, that's going to take time to do, and if we are to do it in an equitable and a responsible and a caring manner, it's going to take time and it's going to take support from government, and I get that. And I don't expect to see the details of how we are going to accomplish that in the throne speech, of course, that's not what it's for. But it's such a critical part of what we need to do here in addressing climate change that I was at least hoping for some sort of mention of it in the throne speech, and preferably a commitment to those things. But again, there was nothing in the throne speech committing to net zero beyond what we've already discussed in this House, nor providing islanders with options for cleaner heat in their homes and supports from government for doing that. Where we need immediate and decisive action on climate, this throne speech offers at best a mediocre approach that kicks the real decisions further down this ever-shortening road that we have in front of us before we hit a wall. This government tells a nice story about wanting to be the first province to reach carbon neutrality, but so far I have seen little indication that they are actually serious about making that a reality. I can't talk about climate change here without at least mentioning carbon pricing. And I must say I'm astounded by this government's constantly shifting position on carbon pricing over the last couple of years. I vividly recall in debates during the last election, the Premier, with great hyperbole, fretting about how a carbon tax would be the ruin of the driver from Tignish. And then things changed. It seemed that government might finally have recognised that carbon pricing is indeed the most cost-effective and the fairest and the most efficient way to reduce emissions, with the most minimal impact on the economy. However, the statement in the throne speech on carbon pricing, and indeed the Premier's response to questions last week in this House, remain somewhat ambiguous about what exactly the plan is for carbon pricing and how these tax revenues will be spent or redistributed to islanders. Giving 100% of carbon tax revenues back to islanders as unconditional payments, not through programs and services that are not universally accessible, would be a far more fair way to redistribute the revenues from carbon pricing to all islanders. Let's remember that when we give rebates, for example, for air-to-air heat pumps in our homes, many low-income islanders firstly don't own their homes and can't afford that upfront cost to do that. So even though this is a worthy program, and I absolutely support those sorts of things that are currently running in efficiency PEI, we need to remember that perhaps the most vulnerable people, the people who would benefit from them most of all, are unable to actually access those programs. A far fairer and more effective way of redistributing that to the people who need it most would be through a fee and dividend model. And I think you could think of that fee and dividend model of returning the money, in all of the money, to islanders in a rebate payment. You can think of that almost as a mini basic income pilot, in that we know that the statistics tell us that high-income earners have a far larger carbon footprint than those with modest incomes. And therefore, when you're paying a carbon tax, high-income earners pay a disproportionately large amount. They are the ones who will fly off to Germany for holidays. They are the ones who will buy boats. They are the ones who will make purchases like that. Low-income islanders do not do that, and yet if we have a rebate program that is equitably distributed, more money will go to low-income islanders than high-income islanders. Again, almost like a mini basic income pilot, and given the tepid commitment to a basic income in this throne speech, that might be the closest thing we actually get to a basic income under this government. I'd like to talk a little bit about housing, Mr. Speaker. An equitable and inclusive society is one in which, at the very minimum, no islander gets left behind. However, a better way to envision this is that every islander should be provided the opportunity to reach their full and unique potential. And in order to achieve this, all islanders must first have their basic needs met. A safe place to live, for example, and some sort of guaranteed minimum income which would provide for them the basic necessities which we all need to live life in security and dignity for themselves and their families. Those are not luxuries. They are necessities, without which people cannot survive, let alone thrive. Now, I'm going to say something that actually should be a very easy thing to say, but that the Premier and his ministers seem either unable or unwilling to utter, and it's this: housing is a basic human right. We all deserve shelter. And the issue that we have these days in the marketplace that we are experiencing, not just here in Prince Edward Island, but across the country, but specifically, and perhaps more than anywhere else in Canada, here in PEI, is that basic human right of housing is butting up against housing also being an opportunity for investment. And sadly, in that situation, money always wins. Islanders are losing, and those with more money than they need to invest in housing here, disrupting the market, taking it out of circulation for rent, jacking up the prices, are putting a number of islanders in a severely vulnerable position. And despite the inherent truth that housing is a basic human right, we hardly saw a mention of the housing crisis that is impacting so many islanders in this throne speech. There was no acknowledgement that housing is indeed a basic human right. There's no mention whatsoever of tenants, not one word of it in this throne speech. And at this point in history, after the lessons that the pandemic has taught us, in light of all the evidence that demonstrates that housing is a critical component to the well-being of not only individuals, but of society and an economy, I find that quite shocking and really disappointing. We simply cannot say that we are doing well as a province when so many islanders still cannot find a safe and affordable place to live. We cannot expect islanders to stay safe in the midst of this serious current outbreak if they don't have anywhere to go to be safe. I'm further troubled that the government seems to think that a vacancy rate change from less than 1% to almost 3% represents a reprieve for the province in the area of our housing crisis. And Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear on this. There is no reprieve for those who have nowhere to sleep tonight, on this cold winter night. There is no reprieve for the renter who cannot find an apartment to rent, let alone one that they can actually afford. There is no reprieve for the family who can't buy a home because all of them are priced way out of their budget. And there is no reprieve for a senior relying on rental supplements to stay housed who can barely afford their groceries for the week. There is no reprieve on Prince Edward Island in the current housing market. Government has to take immediate steps to address the housing crisis that has gripped this province for the last several years. This is not a new problem. We could see this coming. And successive administrations have done far less than they needed to address this critical problem. It's completely unacceptable that this government underspent its housing budget last year substantially. They underspent their housing budget in a housing crisis. It is equally appalling that we saw so little mention of housing in this throne speech. Government must make the Residential Tenancy Act a legislative priority with a fair and transparent consultation process and something that includes the establishment of a rental registry. We've seen in the absence of government's willingness to even do these basic steps that would give us the data that we need on housing in Prince Edward Island, community groups and individuals stepping forward to fill that gap. That's not the way that society has to work. We need government to take the lead. When we have a crisis, government needs to be there to take the lead and to lead our province in a safer and a better direction, and you're not doing that. Islanders are crying for government to step in and do something, anything, about this housing crisis. Our island is becoming a place where only the wealthy can afford a home. What will it take for the Premier to finally take action on this file? The throne speech noted that the Premier's Council for Recovery and Growth found that one of the chief concerns raised by islanders was the desire to mitigate poverty. And despite this government's own admission that this is a priority for islanders, we again saw hardly any mention of how government plans to eliminate poverty. And let's be specific here. When we talk about poverty, the goal, and the Premier has said this himself on many occasions, should and has to be elimination, not mitigation. And I appreciate the fact that he has made that very distinct and deliberate distinction between the two. Because one islander living in poverty is still one too many. And that's why we implore government to develop a comprehensive strategy for the elimination of poverty in our province, one that includes establishing concrete steps towards the adoption of a basic income guarantee in the province, with or without the support of the federal government. But a basic income guarantee is only one of the tools in the toolbox to eliminate poverty. Islanders cannot stand by for years while this government waits for the federal government to make a decision. The need for action on poverty is immediate. The need for action on poverty is now. And that looks like, let me tell you what I feel that looks like. That looks like livable wages. Action on poverty looks like affordable housing. Action on poverty looks like food security. Action on poverty looks like the elimination of student debt. That's the kind of action we're looking for from this government. Mr. Speaker, we are small enough a province to do great and important things. Being small also means that each of us knows the names and faces of islanders living in poverty. This is not some nebulous thought to us. This is something that we see every day in our communities. It's the person we pass on the street every day. It's the child who sits next to your child in class. It's the grocery store clerk I talked about in question period this morning, who, despite the work conditions and the peril that they place themselves in every day, is there with a cheerful smile and a friendly word. It's your next door neighbour. And it's also the lived experience of some of us who sit in this House. It's not good enough to say we're waiting on the federal government to cough up the money. It's not good enough to dedicate 2 short paragraphs in a throne speech to an issue that's impacting islanders in every corner of this province. Islanders expect more, and islanders indeed deserve more. Another important way that government must help all islanders reach their full potential is the provision of early childhood education. Early intervention to address the unique needs of every child before they reach school age is one of the best ways to set children up for a successful and fulfilling life. When we look at other places that do that, that place a very high degree of importance and resources on early learners to intervene when problems are seen and detected early, and to provide the supports that they are able to give to these children who need extra help early on. It not only helps those individuals, but it's an incredibly strengthening thing for a society and for an economy. And I would like us to have a much greater emphasis on those supports for individual young islanders who are struggling perhaps with literacy, perhaps with numeracy, perhaps with behavioral issues, perhaps with psychological problems. We need to have sufficient resources in our schools to support each of those individual young islanders in the unique ways that they require help. Unfortunately, government gave no commitment or mention of universal childcare. It's true that 300 additional spaces will help some, but it does not really help those lower income workers whose critical and essential role in our society was made even more evident, of course, during this pandemic, and something we've talked about at length today in this House. In the official opposition's submission to government, we asked that the throne speech include a commitment to expanding early learning programs and supports, including universal pre-kindergarten. What we got was another empty and eerily familiar promise that this will be addressed further down the road.
6 paragraph page 10. 6 paragraph page 10, right there.
Additionally, expanded access to childcare would not only support island children, but it would also be a significant way to recognise the unpaid work that women still provide in society, as well as to help address the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 pandemic has had on women. Expanded childcare will not be possible without early childhood educators. Government needs to do more to make childcare a priority and to ensure those taking care of and educating our children are paid a living wage.
Did he listen to your priorities? You guys got it.
I did listen to my colleague on this side of the House,
Not on the list.
who made a beautiful statement in the House in response to a ministerial statement regarding the integrity and the strength of the education system, which needs to be supported with resources. And at the bottom of the pyramid that supports that education system are our frontline educators. And,
You need to add to your to-do list,
and
yes.
unless we provide living wages for these educators, not just expanding the number of spaces available to children, but making sure that the resources are there to attract the people we need to these positions and to retain them in those positions. If we do not do that, as my honourable colleague said, the system will collapse. Mr. Speaker, another topic that was missing from the Premier's speech was our schools. Our teachers, staff and students have been amazing, and they've been resilient during this past year, and of course an unprecedented shutdown of schools, and we talked about that in the legislature earlier today, forced teachers and students into this unknown world of online learning. And yet they persevered, and they succeeded. This fall brought an anxious and exciting return to in-class learning for many, and something that I hope we can return to safely soon. Despite the fears of teachers and staff, they prioritised the well-being and education of the students that were returning to their classrooms. Students faced many new rules and changes in their schools, bewildering for a group of people so young. Masks were worn. Some friends, close friends, may not have been in the same cohort. Staying 6 feet apart from the people that you know and love must have been extraordinarily challenging. It's been extraordinarily challenging for us, never mind young people who struggle to understand the context of the changes that have swept across society in the last year. But despite these challenges, our students have taken this in stride, and frankly, from what I and my caucus have witnessed, they have faced this new reality in many ways much better than we have as adults. Our students and our teachers, indeed, as well, have shown us grace and acceptance and compliance. They have inspired us. And what does our government show them in return? A promise to make them more prepared for employment. That's what it says in the throne speech. Mr. Speaker, many of our youth don't just want to be more prepared to enter what are for most of them going to be low-paying jobs. Our students want to revolutionize our economy. They want to revolutionize our island, and they want to be a part of making this a better world. I believe we owe them the opportunity and the flexibility to do so, and that means meeting the needs of each individual student in their unique way where they are every day they come to school. And our current inflexible school system does not give students or teachers the creative space that they need to drive forward the innovation that our island and our children so desperately need and want. COVID has presented unprecedented challenges to our school system and everybody in it, but it has also presented us with an opportunity to carve a new path. Returning to the same old system leaves teachers in a culture of silence and control, and students in a system that let many fall through the cracks and did not allow the majority of them to reach their full potential. I'm disappointed that this government was not brave enough to take this opportunity to implement bold changes that are called for, and bold changes that would better meet the unique needs and improve the lives of every single one of the children and youth in this province. Building an equitable and inclusive society also requires the participation of a diversity of voices. However, our historical realities here on Prince Edward Island have left many in our society marginalised. Government has a responsibility to help amplify those marginalised voices, but it must also help break down the systemic attitudes and behaviours that keep a diversity of voices from being heard. Mr. Speaker, throughout the throne speech, we saw the government inappropriately apply a racial lens as simply a criminal justice issue. In actuality, this incredibly difficult, important and necessary work is about deconstructing systemic racism across all policy areas, all programs and all services. It is not simply a criminal justice concern. We need to see actions furthering reconciliation between all treaty peoples, both Indigenous and settler. We need anti-racism and diversity programs in our communities, in our schools, in our healthcare, where the voices of the BIPOC community are centred and amplified. We need greater newcomer retention and integration activities, and we need efforts to engage other marginalised groups, such as women, the LGBTQ2S+ community, and our youth. We also need to improve our democracy and to empower young people to use their voice and to be part of the decisions that impact their generation by expanding the vote to include 16 and 17-year-old islanders. Interestingly, I read in this government's 2019 speech from the throne, not the current one, but the one shortly after this government was elected. This is what it said, and I quote, "We also need, as a priority, to find ways that we can better engage our young people in the democratic process, as what we do today should be in their interest." That's quite a statement, and I can't think of a better way to engage our young people in the democratic process than passing the piece of legislation that was before this House last sitting and will be reintroduced in this sitting. I look forward to this government supporting the Election Age Act, which will be reintroduced in this House shortly, and in so doing, with your support, you will clearly state your desire to live up to the words that were present in the 2019 throne speech. Supporting our Indigenous communities to uphold and exert their treaty rights is a fundamental step in reconciliation between Indigenous and settler peoples in Canada. Unfortunately, as we saw recently in Nova Scotia, there are elements within society that have mobilised against Indigenous peoples and tried to impede their legal treaty right to conduct a moderate livelihood fishery, a right which is guaranteed by our Constitution and that has been upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. Last fall, this Legislative Assembly unanimously passed a motion introduced by the official opposition in support of those treaty rights, which urged government to ensure that Mi'kmaq fishers in Prince Edward Island are able to exercise this legal right safely and without prejudice. Island Mi'kmaq leaders have indicated their intention to initiate their own moderate livelihood fishery this very spring. However, we are aware of resistance that is already emerging in our province, similar to that we saw in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, government must do everything in its power to protect the legal treaty rights of the Mi'kmaq to conduct this fishery free from violence, free from intimidation, free from threats, and free from prejudice. The first step to this, Mr. Speaker, has to be a strong and unambiguous statement of support, followed by decisive action in collaboration with Indigenous leaders, and unfortunately, we have seen no such meaningful commitment from this government. Often in public discourse, there is criticism of the role government plays in people's lives. Some feel government should be smaller, that it should be less intrusive. But the pandemic has made it clear that government, when it is at its best, exists to do things that people cannot do for themselves. If not for the expertise and guidance of Dr. Morrison and the Public Health Office, we may find ourselves in an entirely and far more devastating situation than we do today. Mr. Speaker, we've seen clear, decisive action on the pandemic from this government. So why is there an absence of that same decisive, clear action from the Premier on so many other critical issues? We've been so fortunate to live relatively COVID-free for the last year. And I'm confident that if we continue to follow public health guidelines and Dr. Morrison's steady advice, we will very soon get back on track. But all the same, we cannot simply ignore the wicked problems that we're talking about this time last year, the same ones that I've raised today. In this House, let us not be afraid to talk about big things. Let us open our minds to the limitless possibilities that are available to us as individuals, and also collectively as a distinct and self-governing community called Prince Edward Island. We should not feel compelled to follow conventional pathways if we can so clearly see that those roads lead us to an unappealing destination. For many decades now, the chosen path for virtually all politicians and jurisdictions has created a system that is concentrating wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. It is crushing hope for far too many young people, all the while destroying our home planet Earth. We can do better than that. Our children demand that we do better than that. Striking out on a road less traveled can be a scary prospect for some. But a new path, while it may be hard to build, is the only sure way that we can get to a new and different destination. The destination that I want to see Prince Edward Island stride purposefully towards is a place where we value above all else our relationships to each other, the maintenance of our land, our water and our air, and the strength of our communities. Those aspirations must be the guiding star that must light our way. As others scramble towards different, destructive and hollow goals of competing with each other to grab the biggest piece of an ever-shrinking pie, let us choose the politics of belonging, of shared prosperity, and a recognition of our connectedness to each other and to this beautiful island. There are a number of things that I think make Prince Edward Island the right place at the right time to be a leader in this politics of belonging. As an island, we know about our limits. Our boundaries are so very clearly defined. We have a history of strong community, a connection to the land and the sea. There is an intimacy to island politics. We have the ability, more than almost any other place of our size, to be self-sufficient. Our character is shaped by frugality and hard work. We mostly aspire to modest levels of materialism. We have the gift of jurisdiction. We are not so big that government feels distant and unresponsive, yet we are not so small that we are unable to tackle the big issues we face. Let us tackle those issues with sharp and open minds and a generosity of spirit worthy of the people we serve and of this special island that we call home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.